All right, so today we are going to be talking about rubrics as it relates to ELA, but it's the context of a rubric doesn't really change between ELA, math, any other subject that you're doing. But when it comes to writing and writing assessments, as we discussed on Tuesday, rubrics become the primary means of how we actually grade, how we actually work with assessments. What is nice about a rubric in application is that it doesn't really matter what your question is, what your topic is, what your subject is. If you have a question, you can make a rubric that is meaningful. The other nice thing about rubrics and scoring essays is because you are defining the rubric itself, you're almost not really worried about validity, right? You're not trying, for the most part, to define a writing level or some of these more concrete concepts. Not concrete isn't the right word, but you're not really trying to define a concept. You're trying to just say, do you do these things? Like you in a rubric, you are measuring directly what is in the paper, not or whatever it is that you're scoring, not trying to say that if you do these things, you have good reading comprehension or numeracy or something like that, right? It's just, did you do the thing? Yes or no, right? So when it comes to validity, you have to be valid because you're measuring what you see, not saying that what you see means something else. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So as good as that sounds, using rubrics, has anyone used a rubric before? Most of you probably have in some way, shape, or form. Has anyone written a rubric before? Secondary people, I'm looking at you. Yes? No? Okay. Using rubrics and writing rubrics can be quite challenging. And the reason for that is you are taking something that is by nature subjective and trying to make it objective. And one step beyond that, you take this subjective thing that you've already tried to objectify, and you're trying to put what turns into be an arbitrary grade to that, right? So grades are not inherently meaningful. We give them meaning. If you get on something like a math assessment or a spelling test, you get so many correct, you get so many incorrect, you divide by 100, you get your percentage. And that we have these arbitrary percentages that make a grade, but they're at least pretty standard, right? On an essay, what does 90% mean? What does 90% on a rubric mean? What does 90% on the essay mean? It really doesn't mean anything. So I think it's really important when you set off to create a rubric or use a rubric, you have to have this understanding that we're going through this three-step process of subjectivity to objectivity, objectivity to what was the word I just used? Shoot, I got it just blanked. About grades. Arbitrary to arbitrariness, right? So subjectivity to objectivity, objectivity to arbitrary, right? And that's challenging to maintain meaning throughout all those three steps. At the end of the day, what you want to communicate to a student is, did you do the thing, in this case, a writing task, effectively, right? By all these different indicators. A rubric is the most effective way that we have of communicating that information. It is far from perfect, but it is a pretty good tool. All right. So what we are going to do today, I was able to adapt this lecture from a university website that drew on a couple of different texts on creating rubrics. And at the end of the day, and what your assignment is going to be, I downloaded, it was like the 2016 New York State or Engaged New York ELA exams. So I have a 3rd grade, 5th grade, and 8th grade ELA scoring materials on Moodle. And what we're going to see is there are 2 types of rubrics that are used. There's a holistic rubric and an analytic rubric. Most of the time we use holistic rubrics, which I'll go over, but I have some problems with those. I want us to be able to, or to make an attempt as a group in appropriate age levels to take those holistic rubrics and make them analytic rubrics. All right. Again, it's going to be a somewhat subjective exercise. There's no right or wrong, but I want you guys to go through that process of taking one type of rubric, go to another type of rubric, and then actually the documents that are on Moodle provide a number of sample essays, and I want you to go through and score those essays using your new rubric. So kind of keeping that in mind, that's where we're going. Okay, sound good? Cool. Okay, so first thing is, how do we go about creating a rubric overall? You are starting with a task, whatever task it is. For writing ELA assessments, you're most likely starting with a writing prompt of some sort. But the prompt isn't really the task that we are looking to assess. What we're looking to assess through the prompt, through the project, through the activity, is some number of objectives or standards. So we have to understand what are the standards or objectives that we're going through or going to try and assess, and what tasks are going to be demonstrated, or what behaviors are we going to see that are going to come to define those end processes, those end goals. All right. So what exactly is going to be assigned? Is it going to be an essay? Is it going to be a project? Is it going to be something that is created or built? And does it break down easily into these measurable tasks that we are going to try and see? Are those tasks important? Are the components important? Are there, what are the objectives for those? So on and so forth. So there are all these different questions that we're going to be asking about the overall thing that we are going to be scoring. So if I am doing a writing task, some of the components that might break down into that are spelling, grammar, style, content. All of these are different components that I can consider relative to the overall important, or relative to their overall importance to the task at hand. All right. So if I have a 5th grade essay, comparative essay, all right, do I care so much about the, I don't want to say the accuracy, let's say it's a historical contrast or comparison, right? Do I care so much about, let's say, outside information that is brought into the essay versus information that, if I have a passage, information that was used from the passage in that comparison? If I'm scoring on comparison, I don't really care about how much extra information you brought in. So content knowledge outside of what's provided in the essay isn't going to be that important, right? What I care about is how well you compare to what was provided in the passage, all right? So maybe having content knowledge wouldn't be a line item, a task that needed to be completed for this type of essay, all right? So we need to be looking, so in what I'm getting at here is in any given essay or in any given project, there are dozens of different components that we could be looking at. We want to try and limit what we are measuring to the most relevant components to the current task, to the current standards, current objectives, all right? Once we know what it is we're measuring, we have to have some semblance of an idea of what a exemplary student work is going to look like and what a low performing student's work is going to look like. That's going to set the ceiling and the floor for what it is that we're actually trying to measure. One of the challenges with rubrics, if you've ever, how many of you have graded essays before? Okay, so one of the interesting things that I go through when I'm grading essays is I'll have my rubric, I'll read the first essay, and I'll say, oh, that's pretty good. Fill out my scores. And then I read the next essay, I'm like, oh, that's really good. But I don't have anywhere up to go from there. So then I have to either revise the previous one down, which is never fun, or I have to understand that my rubric has a ceiling. My rubric only allows for so much high quality. After that, everything is just really good. Everything is exemplary. So exemplary has an ever-extending range. And that's not a bad thing, right? But it's challenging as you're scoring on the fly to kind of adjust your perception. So having a good idea of what an exemplary work looks like is going to be important. So you know what your 100% is. You know what your A is. Conversely, you know what your F is. Because that same problem can happen on the other end. You read one work and you're saying, that's not so great. It doesn't meet any of these criteria, whatever it's going to be. Then you read the next one, it's like, oh, wow, that really needs work. So now I have to bump that up. So kind of knowing what the bounds of what you're looking for are going to help you in development of your rubric. Finally, you want to decide what kind of feedback you want to actually be able to give to your students. Do I want to give detailed feedback? Do I want to give general feedback? Do I want to give content or structural or functional feedback? All of these pieces are going to help you define what those categories are. And to some degree, they're going to help you identify what kind of rubric, holistic or analytic, are going to be important to you. All right. So what are you measuring? What does good look like? And how are you going to give feedback? These are a couple of key examples or ideas when you are creating your rubric. So first question that you end up with is, what kind of rubric will you use? So like I said, the two types of rubrics that we have are holistic and analytic. And I'm sure you have at some point seen both of those. Holistic rubric, good, bad, worse. Great, good, bad. Weak, strong, satisfactory, right? So it gives you the category and it gives you all the characteristics that a project, a task in that category show, all right? That can be done kind of globally, where you just have 1, 2, 3, and it lists all of the different components. Or it can be weak, satisfactory, strong, whatever your levels are, over different areas, different measurement areas. So I could have grammar, weak, satisfactory, strong. Content, weak, satisfactory, strong, so on and so forth. Or I can just say weak is this, satisfactory is this, strong is this. An analytic rubric, on the other hand, uses the same ideas, but it has this kind of internal scoring system attached to it. So I could say that, same idea, I'm going to have some weak, satisfactory, strong type of categorization. I'm going to have content or skill categorization, but within each skill, I'm going to have a range of points. So weak might be 0 to 3 points. Satisfactory, 4 to 7 points. Strong, 9, 8 to 10 points, right? So within the skill and within the level, I have some amount of freedom. So it has, there is a weak and there is a strong weak. There is a weak strong and there is a strong strong. So it allows for that level of differentiation in your scoring within each of those, of those levels. So let's take a look at each of them separately. All right, so I have this a little backwards. Here is an example of a 2-point holistic rubric. This is actually in the PowerPoints that you, or the PDFs that you guys have. So I apologize about the fuzziness, but you'll get the idea. So this is a 2-point holistic rubric. It's scoring 0, 1, 2, weak, satisfactory, strong, right? Weak, satisfactory, strong. And it does exactly what I was talking about before. It says, here is a strong 2-point essay. Here are all the things that includes. Here's satisfactory. Here's what that includes. Here's weak. That's what that includes. All right. What might be some of the strengths of this? From a scoring standpoint, from a development standpoint, from a test taker's standpoint, what's good about this? What do you guys think? Total opinion. Yeah.
I feel like this kind of rubric is less opinionated.
Okay.
And more score you get, score you deserve.
Okay. What about that lends itself? What about this lends itself to that idea?
Just the idea that you have the amount of points and each feature of your essay correlates with those points.
Okay.
So there's really no argument from the student to the teacher.
Okay. Good. What else? How would this be? Would this be an easy rubric to use to score an essay? Unsure. Why?
It's not like it's just like it's not a lot.
Okay, good. So one of the concerns here is that there's very little wiggle room within each of those categories. So kind of converse to what you're saying is, you didn't have all of these, so you didn't get a 2. But the other side is, well, you had some of them, but did you have enough of them to get a 2? Right? So I think that the challenge with these types of rubrics is not for the clearly good essays and not for the clearly okay essays or the clearly bad essays, but all the other ones that are going to fall somewhere in between, right? So that leaves me to, I as the teacher said, yeah, you have this one, but kind of this one, but kind of this one. So do I go with a 2 or do I go with a 1 because 1.5 isn't an option, right? Remember I talked when I was describing that process, I said subjectivity to objectivity. This has a lot of objectivity. You have to have each of these things, but it's still very subjective as to what some of these things are, and there's no weighting to any one of these things. Is evidence of analysis more important than relevant facts? I don't know. But I have to have both to get a 2. And if I have some of that, is that enough to get to a 2 as opposed to a 1? All right. So some of the advantages of the holistic rubric is there's an emphasis on what the learner can demonstrate, right? It's showing how high you can go. There is all of these things. It's not defined by a lack of evidence. It's defined by what is in the essay, the project, right? There's a lot of, it's a simpler rubric to use, right? You don't have to go through and kind of figure out where each little piece falls. You are really just saying, is it there? Yes or no. You circle your 4, you circle your 3, you circle your 4, go on your way. There's no splitting hairs anywhere. So it's a little bit easier to use. I don't know how much I would identify this as, or if I would put this as an advantage or disadvantage. It says can be used consistently across raters, provided there has been training, right? So that calibration part is tricky. I am, as a faculty right now, we're switching from one student teaching rubric to another. And we are in the process. I think we're done now, but we have been calibrated to the new student teaching rubric. It's a 5-point rubric. Maybe I shouldn't be telling you this, and I probably shouldn't be recording this, but the calibration, you had to be, for every indicator that was measured, you had to be within, when you observed it, you had to be within 1 point of what the defined criterion was. All right. So on a 5-point scale, if the actual rating for any one skill was a 3, if you gave a 2, that was okay. If you gave a 4, that was okay. In terms of your calibration, it's a pretty wide range to say, check, you got this, right? Is that really calibration? That's probably the amount of freedom that's needed to get calibration for this type of rubric, but is that really calibration, right? Yes, no, maybe, I don't know. It's challenging, right? So yes, once you are calibrated, it can be used consistently. I would argue that calibrating, like a fine-tuned calibration for this type of rubric, can be really, really hard to achieve. All right. Some disadvantages, they do not always provide specific feedback for improvement. Again, there's no real, since it's focused on what is present, there's no real way to say what's not present. If I have a mostly literal recounting of events, I'm not saying this is where you missed that, this is where you missed that. And obviously I would provide additional feedback, but it's not about the specifics of what you did. It's about the gestalt, the general, all right? Right here, can be difficult to choose a score when student work is at varying levels across the criterion. So that's exactly kind of what our 2 pieces spoke about. One way to alleviate that is to add more levels. You don't have to have just a 2-point holistic rubric. You can have 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 or 9 or 10. But once you get into that many, you've essentially built yourself an analytic rubric, right? So you've lost really what defines the holistic rubric, which is the simplicity of it. So by limiting the range that you're really working with, you are pigeonholing yourself into this type of problem, okay? And then the last disadvantage here that's listed is that the criteria cannot be weighted. So what that means is, let's say, and as you'll see in the New York supplement that you have and with other holistic rubrics, this is not the only way to do it. Each of these bullets could be their own line item down the left side, and then 0, 1, and 2 can be across the top, right? With a holistic rubric though, let's say I have content and spelling. All right, let's say those are the 2 categories that I'm looking at. Each of those is going to be 0, 1, or 2. And at the end, if I get a 2 in spelling or in content and a 0 in spelling, then I get a 1 overall, 50-50, right? As we'll see on an analytic, I could say that the 3 levels are 0, 5, and 10 points, and on spelling is 0, 1, and 2. So if I get a 10 on content and a 0 on spelling, now it's 10 out of 12 instead of 2 out of 4. See what I'm saying there? So there's no weighting that can go, that can happen in a holistic rubric. Everything, each of those skill levels are weighted the same. All right. So super fast overview, but I think that works. Any questions about the holistic rubric? The challenge with the holistic rubric, as with any rubric, is going to be in deciding the actual language that goes into each of these descriptions. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later. All right. All right. So an analytic rubric, on the other hand, presented in a similar way to what we're used to seeing as a rubric, but you're going to have these score ranges. All right. As you'll see, so we have organization, content, style down the side. This was online for an oral presentation. 0 to 2, that's fine. But then we see in the satisfactory range, 3 to 5 points, 5 to 7 points, and 3 to 6 points. That should say 3 to 7 points, right? 6 to 8 points. I don't know where they got. Oh, that's right. So they're saying that there's no such thing as 3 or 4 points available here. It's just weighting this even more. Okay, so 0 to 2, 5 to 7, or 10 to 13 points. And you end up getting your score across the row and down the columns, right? So here we're saying that style is more important than organization, content is more important than style, based on the total number of points available. So if you get below expectation in organization, exemplary in content, and satisfactory in style, that's going to yield a better score because exemplary is weighted higher. All right. So having those types of ranges allows you to weight the actual importance of any one of these categories over another. When I make my my rubrics for projects in Moodle, I go one step further. I typically don't have the below expectation, satisfactory, exemplary. I don't have anything at the top, because I might have 4 levels for content or 5 levels for content, whereas only 2 or 3 for something like organization. And what I'm really looking for in my analytic rubrics, again, are how significant are the differences between each of those different levels. So if I can identify the more significant differences that I can identify, one, that's probably the more points I'm going to add. Two, probably the more weight I'm giving to that idea. All right. Let's say you have an essay where you are asking them to, in some way, shape, or form, discuss 5 different ideas. Each one of those ideas needs to have a component. Discusses all 5, discusses 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5, 2 out of 5, 1 out of 5, right? If you don't, you're losing an idea somewhere. That's probably, and touching on all 5 is probably going to be significant. So when I write that rubric, 1 out of 5 ideas is going to be worth 5 points. 2 out of 5 is going to be worth 10 points, all the way up to 25 points, right? That's out of a 100-point rubric. Now I have 25% of my my score is, did you address all 5 things? And that's a very objective way of looking at it. It's not saying, well, you kind of hit 4 of them or kind of hit 5. It's no, you only got to 4. That's 5 points that you couldn't get, period. All right. So advantages of the analytic rubric: it allows you to be very specific within the rubric itself on the type of feedback that you're able to give. You are able to say, at the grammar level, you got 3 out of 5 points. Here's why. And here's what defines a 3, which should be emblematic of that essay. On content, you got 10 out of 15 points. Here's what defines 10 specifically, as opposed to 6, as opposed to 3, as opposed to 0, as opposed to 15. So in defining each of those point values, you are giving that specific feedback. Again, the holistic rubric doesn't allow for that. At best, it allows for generalities. Other advantage, as we talked about, each of those categories, each criterion can be weighted for their specific significance. It's so easy I find, on an analytic rubric to demonstrate to whoever is doing the assessment what is important, what should be focused on, right? Just through the weights. If you see that content and organization are worth 75 points and spelling and grammar are worth 10 points, you're not going to worry so much if you are not a good speller, right? If you see that flipped, spelling and grammar are worth everything, you're going to really struggle if you're not a good speller, and you're going to take your time on that, right? So through the weighting, you're able to demonstrate that level of significance. Disadvantages, they take a long time to create. If you have, 6 or 7 categories, you have 4 or 5 different levels, you have to the degree possible, objectively define each of those levels. You have to be able to identify the minutia between a 2-point score, a 4-point score, a 6-point score, an 8-point score, whatever that might be, right? So really thinking about what goes into each of those levels is just time consuming. I argue that that's going to make this even stronger, which is going to give that much more weight and significance to the analytic rubric overall, but it does take more time. May not be used consistently across raters unless extremely well defined. I would argue if you are not extremely well defined, you're back in a holistic rubric, right? The analytic rubric, it's analytic by definition, is going to have those more well-defined criteria. So if you don't have that, and are getting inconsistency, then I think you're back in the holistic, which is more subjective, which has to be calibrated. All right. Any questions there? Analytic versus holistic. What do you guys think you would have preferences for as teachers in your own administering of rubrics? Analytic or holistic? All right, there you go, right? Easier to make, done. That's step one. We have enough on our plates, right? That's real. That is absolutely real. Can I give meaningful feedback without taking up all of my time? And if the answer to that is yes, then absolutely, go with that, go with that. Certain projects might lend themselves more toward that holistic rubric that you can just boom, boom, boom. Did you do it? Did you not? Right? That's totally fine. Good. What else? Taylor.
I was going to say something similar, which was like, depending on what the project is, I think I might lean more towards analytic. Just depends on the weight of it, because you know I like the extra feedback and the specificness of it.
Okay. Good. Good. Yeah.
So I was saying, especially in the English classroom, analytics would be a lot better, especially when grading essays.
Okay. What about formative versus summative? Which would you prefer for formative? What was that? Okay, why?
Because formatives are kind of like a quick pace kind of
Okay.
assessment. So
Okay, all right. Agree, disagree? Different reasons for agreeing?
So I think could be like formative to be analytic, keeping it like specific, like and how to change it. You know?
That's kind of, that's where I typically would land. As I'm thinking about it, that's where I would land. As I think about what I end up doing in practice, that's where I land. Right? And I don't, for better or worse, I typically give, as we're teaching, I typically give more general feedback. Yes, this was overall good to the level that I expect you at. And then like on my finals, I end up with a really analytic rubric. But as I was asking the question, I was right with you. I was thinking when you're doing formative, you want to be able to give that specific feedback so they know, your students know what their need to improve on. And then when you get to summative, most of the time they're never going to see it again, right? They turn it in, they go on summer break, they're done. They don't care. You barely care, right? You're just getting your grades in. But I think that's backwards. I don't know. Any other thoughts? Again, no right or wrong on any of this. Okay. Thinking about the type of feedback that you want to be able to give is one piece. Thinking about what is going to be significant to your evaluation is going to be another. On formative throughout the year, you don't necessarily, in terms of the type of evaluation you need, the grade you're giving, you don't need it to be so specific. You're not done teaching yet, right? But at the end of the year, there's a standard. Did you meet it? And you want to be able to say specifically what components of that were or were not met. I don't know. Something to think about. Okay, so as we are actually creating our rubrics, this is far and away the hardest part. Defining the actual criteria that, okay, this is not the hardest part. The next one's the hardest part. So defining the criteria is defining the pieces that are going to go down the left-hand side, right? So content, clarity of ideas, grammar and spelling, organization. Those are the pieces that go down the left. What are the things that we are measuring? In almost any project, in any essay, there are going to be components that are not as relevant to what you are trying to accomplish as others. It's not possible, and it shouldn't be such, that we are evaluating every single aspect of an essay. There are going to be aspects of an essay that are left off. The exception to that is something like a truly summative essay or truly summative assessment, where you are putting the whole picture together. And by that, I really mean your SATs, your praxis, your certification type tests or assessments, where you are really demonstrating the totality of what you have learned. Formative assessments, I would even say to some degree grade level summative assessments, there are going to be components that don't need to be measured. And when you look at the standards, the state standards, you'll see there are things that a child may or may not do that are not relevant to those grade level standards. So if they don't do something that's a 5th grade standard and you're in 4th grade, you don't have to evaluate on that. But conversely, if they do something that's outside of the purview of those standards, you don't want to assess that. That's not what you're looking at as a relevant criterion to this that grade level or to that task. All right. When you're looking at the specific criteria themselves, can they be observed and measured? That's what every component of the rubric, that's what you want to be able to really say yes to. All right. When we talked about going from subjectivity to objectivity, that's the biggest one. Can we observe it? Can we measure it? It's very hard in aesthetic writing to measure function. Function is like an emotional response in your reader and is going to change from reader to reader. But that is the point of aesthetic writing. So what do we do instead? We say, what are the indicators of that function? Do you include pieces that, I don't even know what it would be, but do you include the components that would lead to that sort of function? All right. In like more nonfiction type writing, your function is to communicate facts. So it's much easier to say includes relevant information, includes X amount of relevant information. All right. So the more subjective the writing, the harder it's going to observe or measure those types of criteria. Are the criteria important and essential? Are they distinct from other criteria? You want to make sure that, again, you're measuring relevant things. You're measuring things that can be observed. You're measuring things that are relevant. And you don't really want to double dip. So if you have an essay where organization and style overlap, comparison is a good example of that. Comparison writing is a good example of that. You might not need to evaluate on both of those different levels. All right. So each criterion should be measuring a distinct component of what you're looking at. All right, defining the rating scale itself. This is the hardest part, sorry, but it's also the most important part. If you are giving a rubric with an assessment, students should have the opportunity to read through the rubric. Hopefully it's not the first time they've seen it, and have an understanding of what it's going to actually take to get an exemplary paper. What do I need to get that rightmost column? That's where it is, all right? The challenge that I find is I always want to put actual objective criteria for every one of my ratings, and it's not possible. But for my, like, say, spelling and grammar, whether it's a % accuracy or a number accuracy, I always want to put that in. Makes no more than 5 spelling mistakes, right? 90% accuracy in spelling. That makes it crystal clear. You can't argue with me, right? But is that significant? Is that really significant to, is the difference between 5 errors and 6 errors significant? Is what I'm getting at there. Having, the answer has to be no, right? Has to be no. Talking about functionality and subject, trying to make those subjective criteria more meaningful, I think is appropriate. When it comes to spelling and grammar, one of the common ways that it's said is interferes, the degree to which it interferes with the ability to read the paper, right? That's a really good function, but it's so subjective. Now, there are extreme cases where on both sides, where spelling and grammar clearly do not impact my ability to read this paper at all, or spelling and grammar are completely non-existent, and you wrote, 600 words in 1 sentence, and I can't decipher it. But again, it's the gray area. That's where that challenge lies. All right. So making sure your students are very clear about what it's going to take to do well on a given assignment through the rubric is the better, the more clear you're able to be with that, the better off your students are going to be. All right. Numbers are descriptive labels. The types of descriptive labels, the order that you list them, those all impact how a learner interprets and works with a rubric, but they're not nearly as important as that first one. Coming up with those labels, or the components of each of those achievement levels, that's going to be what makes your rubric sink or swim. All right, and finally, actually going to write those descriptions. So well-written descriptions here, again, are observable and measurable. Use parallel language across the scale. So that means that for each of those content levels, you're going to have the same descriptors. Does well, missing some, non-existent, right? You're not going to change the analytic descriptor in each of those different levels. That idea lends itself more towards a holistic rubric where there aren't going to be those kind of fine tunings to each of those different levels. And then finally, indicate the degree to which the standards are met. So I think that's best done with an analytic rubric where you can have those point values and have that weighted range. Getting this all on paper, it's clunky though, right? You find yourself being redundant in many ways. You find yourself saying, well, what does that really mean? How am I really going to measure that? Honestly, the only way to learn with a rubric is to make one, try it, and see what you get, right? Rubrics more than, and activities that go with rubrics, more than any other activities, are where teachers are going to have the ability, whether it's formative, more than likely formative, less likely summative, but teachers are going to have the ability to make their own thing. Whether it's you make your own assignment, you make your own rubric, you have your own writing prompts. This is where you are going to have more freedom to create and give your own assessments in ways that are meaningful to you. Most other, like we talked about with reading, as we'll see with math, it's very challenging for that validity reason to know whether or not the assessment that you are creating is valid. Like I said, that's not really a concern here. You are specifically defining what it is that you are measuring. So this is a great opportunity for you to actually create your own assessments. All right. Cool. Any questions? Okay. For the assignment, and I had in my head how I wanted to do this. I think it's still the right thing to do. So if you, when you go onto Moodle, here, I'll pull it up. Okay, so when you go onto Moodle, there are these three, you can see it, these three PDFs right here. So there's a 3rd grade, a 5th grade, and an 8th grade rubric, and I'll go to the middle one. So these files are unfortunately huge, but don't worry, we're not going to be using a ton of them. Towards the beginning though, I think it's in the same location for each of these. There's a 4-point holistic rubric, all right? There's also the 2-point, which is where it came from. But there's this 4-point holistic rubric. I'm going to, and this recording is for the online section as well. The online section, this is going to be done individually, but same idea. I'm going to be putting you guys into groups, or I want you to get back into smaller groups, but of your appropriate grade level. So secondary, early, and later early elementary. I want you to take the weekend and look over this rubric. And our goal is going to be to take this holistic rubric, modify it, both in terms of points and language, and turn it into an analytic rubric. All right, so you'll have the same rubric as a holistic rubric as given, and an analytic rubric that you've created. All right, so that's part 1. Then, if we scroll way down, this is not, yeah, so this is 1 out of 4. You're going to pick, here we go, nope. These are the 2-point papers. There's hundreds of pages of essays. Here you see it says apply 2-point holistic rubric. You're going to find one that's for the 4-point. Here we go. It's got to be it. Okay. So you're going to read through the prompt or the story. That was up above. Read through the exemplary response descriptions, and then actually grade, I think I said 2 or 3 of the examples that are on here using your analytic rubric. So this is going to be done individually. So in a group, you take the holistic rubric, turn it into an analytic rubric. Individually, you're going to find however many I said, 2 or 3 of the essays that use the 4-point rubric and score the essay using your new analytic rubric. All right. And if more than anything, it's an exercise in looking at how an analytic rubric can be used for scoring and how easy or challenging it is. But I want you to compare the score that you got relative to the score that they said below with their response, and see if your analytic rubric gave you a different overall value. All right, that's your assignment. Sound good? Okay. For Tuesday, I'm happy to facilitate this online. It doesn't have to be in here. I'll reach out to you guys and let you know what it's going to be. Tuesday, I'm going to give you class time. On the schedule, it says class Tuesday, no class Thursday. I'm going to switch those. All right, so hopefully nobody made plans. Tuesday would not be in class, but it would be an opportunity for you guys to get together and to actually put those rubrics together. So you have the weekend to look over it, and then you'll have time to put it together. And then Thursday we'll be back in class. All right, that makes sense? Okay. If we do it online, what I will do is create breakout sessions. And so as you come in, I'll just shoot you to your group. So I'll email you guys your groups. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll email you guys your groups, and then you guys as a group decide which direction you want to go. Okay, yeah. Yep, exactly. So you don't have to create a rubric from scratch, but I want you to be able to weight the different components of the holistic rubric. If you as a group want to change the language in one of those cells, you go all the way back up. If you want to make the language in here more analytic, more objective, you're more than welcome to do that. But starting with these ideas and then going from there. Okay, cool. All right, any questions? Cool. So keep an eye out for an email from me. I'm going to try and make, I think, 6 different groups. So 2 secondary and 4 elementary. If I get your secondary or elementary major wrong, just let me know and I'll make sure that you get into the appropriate group. Okay. All right. Have a good one. And we'll see you next week.